If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. Under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office.
Robert Mueller's very appearance today was a rebuke to Attorney General William Barr, and specifically a rebuke to what Barr told the American people in Congress, that somehow Mueller had decided on his own not to charge the president.
If the special counsel found facts sufficient to constitute obstruction of justice, would he have stated that finding?
If he had found that, then I think he would state it, yes.
Okay. Was it special counsel Mueller's responsibility to make a charging recommendation?
I think the Deputy Attorney General and I thought it was, but not just charging, but to determine whether or not conduct was criminal.
Okay, that may have been his understanding, but that was not Robert Mueller's understanding. Robert Mueller was operating on the Justice Department's rules, not his own. Today, after the Mueller speech, the special counsel's spokesman took the extraordinary step of handing out a statement to the media which featured Bill Barr's words versus Mueller words to compare and contrast, in case it wasn't clear enough the first time that Robert Mueller was contradicting Barr.
If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. Under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office.
For more on Mueller's rebuke of Bill Barr, let's bring in journalist Marcy Wheeler of Empty Wheel and MSNBC legal analyst Paul Butler, a former federal prosecutor. Marcy, you have been writing at length about this for a very long time, extremely deep in the weeds of all the sort of Jesuitical parsing that we've gotten from Bill Barr. And it really is it's remarkable because in a technical sense, I don't think he lied about things, but the full cumulative effect was to communicate that had Mueller found sufficient evidence, he would have said so or made a charging recommendation. And Mueller very specifically today, it seemed to me, wanted to push back more on that than almost anything else. What did you think?
Well, I think that's true, although I think if we can get to the emphasis Mueller put on the other activities that Russia did, which are in Volume 1, which are outreaches to Trump, which are also part of the Russian effort. But on the obstruction thing, absolutely. I mean, Mueller made it clear today that it was about the OLC memo. The OLC memo says you can't charge a sitting president. The OLC memo says you can't investigate a sitting president. And that's something that Barr has at times suggested that Mueller should not have done once he decided he wasn't going to charge. And then finally, Mueller said, well, you know, the other reason we're not doing this is because it's Congress's job. And therefore, again, emphasizing, which was in the report and not mentioned at all by Barr, which is that it's now Congress's job to do the work.
This is the line, Paul, that I keep coming back to. I want to play this again because it led to this crazy sort of joint statement today. But here's the sort of but-for line that Barr kept using. Take a listen to what he had to say.
He was not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found a crime. He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
So he was not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found a crime. But he was also not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found a crime, because what he was doing was rejecting the hypothetical and saying, I'm making no determination one way or another about a crime because the Constitution and the OLC bars me from doing so.
That's right. So we know that Mueller wrote Barr a letter criticizing the way that Barr had misrepresented Mueller's report. Now we know what that's about. So Barr said that he was going to exonerate Trump on obstruction. Mueller said, well, the Justice Department won't let me charge Trump with a crime. If I thought he was not guilty, I would tell you.
That's right, exactly. So, I can't charge him, but I would tell you if he was not guilty. Fill in the blanks.
This was all about Mueller wanting to have the last word. This is for history. You know, Chris, sometimes employees fantasize about how on their last day at the job, they're going to tell off the boss. That's kind of what Mueller did today about Barr.
That's well said. Marcy, you just raised something about the volume one, the sort of other materials. And I do want to return to that because one of the things that was so striking to me about Mueller compared to Barr is he leads with and ends with the fundamental substance of the issue, which was this coordinated, systematic, criminal counterintelligence and intelligence sabotage of an American election and how important it was to get to the bottom of that.
But he also said multiple systematic efforts and numerous efforts emanating from Russia. We've always emphasized, especially Barr, because Barr didn't mention the other stuff at all in his 4-page memo. It's always been about two things: the hack and leak and the trolls. And by mentioning numerous and multiple, and he makes a reference in there to the other things our report describe, those are all about the outreaches to Trump.
Right.
So, you know, when Barr is trying to find the conspiracy behind the conspiracy, I wrote something on George Papadopoulos' testimony last October that is sort of the root of this, you know, deep state coup thing that we're now pursuing. He said then, when I pled guilty, I thought it was a real conspiracy. I don't think it's a real conspiracy anymore. What Mueller did today was to say the outreach to Papadopoulos, the outreach to Manafort, the outreach to Don Jr., WikiLeaks, all of those things emanated from Russia, and all of those things were part of the effort to interfere in the election. It's not just number one and number two. It's all of those little efforts. Yes, there wasn't enough evidence to charge, and that's important, but they were part of Russia's efforts, and that's what we've been forgetting for the past 6 weeks.
Paul, what do you think of that?
Yeah, you know, I think that's right. What Mueller emphasized is that the Russians attacked the United States.
That was his word.
They attacked our election. That's the word that he used, attacked. And as to why he spent 2 years doing a report if he couldn't indict the president, what he said is that the work was about, number one, a referral to Congress. When I was a federal prosecutor and we declined a case, we often referred it to a civil agency like an inspector general for them to take action. The other reason Mueller said he spent 2 years on this work was to provide a record of evidence for a future prosecutor, because the president can be indicted when he leaves office.
All right, Marcy Wheeler and Paul Butler, thank you so much. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.